The world saw the Gemini twins, a marvel of balance and grace, two souls bound as one, moving with a silent understanding that stole the breath from any crowd. But the truth, the quiet, hard truth, was that they were just cargo, a single entry in a cruel ledger, owned by the very man who promised them a stage. What they risked wasn't just their names, it was the very right to breathe free air, to be seen as men, to walk without a master. Tonight, I'll show you how they unwrote themselves from that bondage, how they found freedom in the spaces between the lines. How does a single body, counted as property, vanish from the world's books? Lord, it's been so long since I saw this old thing. This here poster, yellowed with time, it don't tell the half of it. I touched the brittle paper, careful not to tear it, and I can almost feel the chill of the tent air from all those years ago. It was a damp, heavy kind of cold that settled in your bones, even in the middle of summer. I can still smell it, that mix of damp sawdust and stale animal sweat clinging to everything backstage. That was the air Thomas and Arthur breathed, day in and day out, in the dim, cramped corner they called their own. They were getting ready, I reckon, for another show. Their costumes, all bright colors and sparkle for the crowd, lay folded on a rough wooden box. You could see the stiff, starched collar of one of those shirts, poking up, just waiting to be pulled tight around their necks. It always struck me how those fancy collars were meant to make them look grand, but they had a way of feeling like a noose holding them in place. Thomas, he'd be helping Arthur, or maybe it was the other way around. You couldn't rightly say where one began and the other ended. They moved as one, always, a dance born of necessity, and, I believe, a deep, quiet love for each other. The manager, a man named Mr. Silas, he didn't see two men, you see. He saw the Gemini twins, a unique attraction, a piece of his show, an item to be bought and sold. The law, back then, it wasn't much kinder. If you weren't on the books as a person, with a name and a place, well, you were just a thing. And for Thomas and Arthur, that was their lot. They were born into it, conjoined at the sides, sharing a body that the world decided was too strange to be counted as two souls. 4 legs they had, but only 2 arms between them, moving like a single, graceful shadow. Their feats of balance, the way they moved as one, it was a marvel, yes, but it was also their cage. They were the Gemini twins, the act, the property, never just Thomas and Arthur, the men. Their whole life was tied to that circus, to the rattling of the heavy wooden wagon wheels, to the sticky layer of cheap grease paints on their faces. Outside of that tent, outside of the posters like this one, they had no standing, no papers, no names that meant anything to a clerk or a constable. If they ever tried to leave, to just walk away, the law would catch them quick enough. Vagrancy, they'd call it. And without a name, without a recognized body, they'd be swept up and put right back where they belonged, right back in Mr. Silas's pocket, or worse. That was the cruel truth of it. Their freedom wasn't just about escaping the circus grounds. It was about escaping the very idea that they were just cargo, not men at all. What good is a body if your soul ain't even on the books at all? The world outside the tent, Lord, it wasn't much kinder than the world inside it. I reckon the boys, Thomas and Arthur, they knew that truth deep down in their bones. But a man, or 2 men in one, they still got to try and stretch their legs, even if those legs ain't entirely their own. It was a muddy street. I remember that much. The kind of street where the wagon wheels dug deep ruts, and the rain turned the dust to a thick, clinging mess. The circus grounds weren't far. You could still hear the distant hollering. Barkers trying to lure folks in, their voices like rusty hinges on a gate. Thomas and Arthur, they'd slipped away from the tents for a spell, just wanting to walk among the regular folk, to buy a simple apple or a loaf of bread maybe. They moved with that careful, practiced rhythm of theirs, a dance learned from years of being tied one to the other, making their way through the jostle and shove of the crowd. They found a stall, I recall, piled high with fresh-baked goods, steam still rising from some of the loaves. Arthur, he reached out his free hand, Thomas guiding their shared body forward just so, and laid a few coins on the rough wooden counter. "A loaf, if you please, ma'am," Arthur said, his voice soft, polite as could be. The woman behind the counter, she looked at the coins, then at their faces, then at their shared form, and her smile, it just withered away like a flower in frost. "Ain't got no business with circus folk," she mumbled, her eyes darting around, afraid someone might see her talking to them. "And certainly not with property." She pushed the coins back across the counter, her hand not quite touching theirs, like they carried a sickness. "You boys belong to that Mr. Silas, don't you? Heard him say it himself. Ain't no honest trade to be done with what ain't got no say in its own dealings." The words, they were like a cold iron lock snapping shut, not on a cage, but on their very hope. My old hands, they ain't what they used to be. I got to hold this poster, just so, to catch the lamplight. It reminds me of how those boys had to hold themselves, always just so, lest they upset the delicate balance of their lives. It was a terrible shame, I tell you. They stood there, the coins heavy in their hand, the bread smelling sweet and out of reach. It wasn't just a loaf they couldn't buy. It was the right to stand there, like any other man, and make a simple trade. The crowd, they just stared, some with pity, most with that hungry look of folks who paid to see what was different, then judged it for being so. They were the Gemini twins on the posters, a marvel for the paying eye, but off the stage they were just cargo, a thing owned with no voice to call its own, no money to spend, no self to claim. The truth of it, it hit them harder than any whip, that the circus wasn't just the tent, but the whole world that saw them as a display, not as men. How do you fight a cage made of words when you ain't even got words of your own? Lord, it's been so long since I saw that old thing. This here poster, yellowed with time, it don't tell the half of it. I touched the brittle paper, careful not to tear it, and I can almost feel the chill of the tent air from all those years ago. Thomas and Arthur, they were called the Gemini twins, and the world saw them as one marvel. But I reckon they were two souls, locked in a single frame, and that frame belonged to the circus, not to them. They were a sight to behold, those two, conjoined at the side like they were meant to walk the earth as one. 4 legs they had to carry them, but only 2 arms to reach out to the world. And they moved, Lord, they moved with a grace that would take your breath. They performed their synchronized dances and balances, a wonder to the crowds who paid their pennies to stare. But the law, it didn't see wonder. It saw the Gemini twins as just one item on a ledger, a piece of cargo, like a trained bear or a painted wagon. If they ever tried to step out of that circus shadow, outside the reach of the big top, they'd be arrested for vagrancy. That was just how life was, hard and unforgiving. And the law had a way of seeing what it wanted to see, not what was true. Thomas and Arthur, they had left the circus grounds one crisp morning, hoping to buy some simple flour and dried meat from a market stall. They held out their hard-earned coins, but the storekeeper, a man with a face like a sour apple, just shook his head. "Can't take money from circus property," he'd grumbled, loud enough for folks to hear. "You boys belong to Silas, not to yourselves." The coins felt cold and heavy in their single shared hand, and the shame burned hotter than any summer sun. They were turned away, their hunger still gnawing, because a piece of paper owned them. It was a terrible shame, I tell you. My old hands, they ain't what they used to be. I got to hold this poster just so, to catch the lamplight. It reminds me of how those boys had to hold themselves, always just so, lest they upset the delicate balance of their lives. Now later that night, the air in Mr. Silas's office was thick, heavy with the smell of cheap whiskey and cigar smoke. A lamp, its flame flickering low, cast long dancing shadows across the cramped space. On the manager's desk, a worn, leather-bound ledger lay open, its pages filled with neat, cruel lines of ink. Mr. Silas, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, lifted a glass to his lips, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. Thomas and Arthur stood before him, their performance costumes still clinging to them, stiff and starched. They were tired, the day's humiliations weighing on their shoulders as much as the shared weight of their own bodies. Silas looked at them, not with anger, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man counting his inventory. "You boys understand your place, don't you?" Silas's voice was smooth, like oil, but it had an edge of iron. He didn't wait for an answer, just took another slow sip of whiskey. "You ain't got no names in the world, not really. Just the Gemini twins. You're an act. My act." He tapped a finger on the open ledger. "Right here, on these pages. Property of Silas's Grand Traveling Circus." Arthur, the quieter one, shifted his weight, and Thomas, always quicker to speak, tightened his jaw. "We just wanted to buy some food, Mr. Silas," Thomas said, his voice low. "We earned the money fair." Silas chuckled, a dry rattling sound. "Earned it for me, boy. And I provide your keep, don't I? A roof over your heads, food in your bellies, better than what's out there." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You step outside this lot, beyond my protection, and what are you? Two men, or one, with no papers, no name, no claim, just vagrants." He paused, letting the word hang in the smoky air like a threat. "The law, it don't care about your hunger, boys. It just cares about order. And if I were to release you, as some folks say, the authorities would be quick to scoop you up. No place to go, no way to earn an honest living, not in their eyes. Just a jail cell or worse, the poorhouse. They'd break you up, or try to, just to make you fit their idea of what's right." The words were a cage, stronger than any iron bar. They saw it then, clear as day. The circus wasn't just a place they performed. It was the only place they could exist without being hunted. The world outside, the world of decent folk and honest work, was a trap set by different rules, but just as final. Sometimes, I reckon, a man's biggest freedom is knowing the size of his cage. Is there any escape when the world outside the cage is just another, bigger cage? The fading light of day always brought a chill, even in the heart of summer, and it had a way of making the circus grounds feel smaller, like a trap closing in. Thomas and Arthur, they knew that feeling well. Of an evening, they would stand at the very edge of the encampment, where the muddy tracks of the wagons met the rough dirt road that led into town. A gas lamp, sputtering and coughing like an old man, cast a sickly yellow glow over the scene. You could still smell the damp sawdust clinging to the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of burnt sugar from the concession stands. But out here, on the edge, it was mostly just the dust and the quiet hum of the world moving on. They would stand there, watching the townspeople go about their lives. Folks would walk by, arm in arm, their faces tired but peaceful. A man might stop to light his pipe, then move on, heading toward a small house with a porch swing. Another fellow, he'd be carrying a rolled-up paper, maybe a deed to some land, looking pleased as punch. They saw mothers with their children buying little trinkets from a street vendor, just simple things. These were folks who could buy, who could sell, who could walk into any store and be treated like a person with a name and a place in the world. They were free to sign papers, to own a little piece of the earth, to simply be without anyone questioning if they had the right to it. I reckon it was a terrible thing to watch, to see a life so close yet so far away. It wasn't just the fences of the circus that held them, you see. It was the fences in people's minds and the fences made of paper. Thomas and Arthur, they yearned for that quiet, ordinary life, the kind that didn't need bright lights or a barker's shout. They wanted to buy a loaf of bread without being called circus property. They wanted to walk down a street without feeling the weight of everybody's eye, not just on their bodies, but on the invisible chains that bound them to Mr. Silas's ledger. It was in those quiet moments, standing under that flickering gas lamp, that a notion began to form, slow and hesitant, like a seed pushing through hard ground. If the world only saw what was written down, if their problem was less about flesh and more about ink, then maybe there was a way to unwrite themselves. A quiet whisper in their shared mind. The idea that freedom wasn't just about running away, but about disappearing from the records that told the world they were owned. It was a faint hope, but it was a seed all the same. If the world only sees what's written, what happens when you write yourself out of it? It's a curious thing, how a man comes to learn the shape of his own cage. Sometimes it ain't made of iron bars at all, but of the very air you breathe, and the words folks use to talk about you. Thomas and Arthur, they had their share of bars, Lord knows, but the real prison was quieter, you see. A few weeks after that market shame, the boys found themselves watching Mr. Silas, the owner, inside his tent. It was late, past the time when the last huckster had yelled his wares and the crowds had gone home to their beds. The gas lamps in Silas's private tent cast a sickly yellow light, making the shadows dance like hungry things. The air was thick and heavy with the smell of cheap cigar smoke and something else, something like old ambition gone sour. They stood quiet just outside the main flap, where the canvas was pulled back a bit, letting them see in without being seen. Silas, he wasn't barking at the crowd now. He was hunched over a big, leather-bound book, thick as a preacher's Bible. His fingers, fat and quick, tapped on the pages, then dipped into a canvas bag, pulling out coins that clattered like dry bones against the polished wood of his desk. He wasn't just counting pennies, though. No, he was counting them. He was counting everything and everyone that made up his show. Each page was a name, a contract, a debt owed, or a profit earned. It was all there, laid out in neat black ink. My eyes ain't what they used to be for fine print, but I remember how sharp those boys were. watching everything. They saw the owner, a slick man, not just counting pennies, but counting people. This poster here, it was just one of his many properties, like them boys. It had a way of showing you the truth, that big book did. It showed them that Mr. Silas's power, it didn't come from his loud voice or the way he snapped a whip. It came from the ink on those pages, from the contracts he'd had folks sign, from the records of ownership that made them just another entry in his books. Their very lives, their worth. It was all written down there, a simple line in a ledger. That was the moment, I reckon, when they saw the cold bureaucrats pen for what it truly was, their real cage. It wasn't the tent that held them, or the watchful eyes of the roustabouts. It was the paper, the words, the way they were marked down as property, plain as day. They understood then that running away wouldn't be enough. They had to figure out how to unwrite themselves, how to make that ink disappear. It was a terrible thought, but it was also a kind of dawning, a new light in a dark place. If every soul has a price, what's the cost of being priceless? It was a hard road, you see, a cruel road for those boys. They'd put a bit of coin aside, a little here, a little there, from the few kind souls who saw more than just a show. They had a hope, a whisper in their hearts, that maybe a bit of money could buy them some quiet corner of the world. But money, like everything else, had its own rules, rules that weren't made for them. I reckon it was mid-morning when they walked into that little bank. Not a grand place, mind you, just a counter set up in a dusty room, smelling of old paper and new money, the kind of place where folks came to put their savings, to write down their names and claim what was theirs. Thomas, he held the small cloth bag tight, the coins clinking soft inside, while Arthur stood steady beside him. They walked up to the counter, slow and careful, just like they did everything. The man behind the counter, he was thin as a rail and had spectacles perched on his nose. He looked at them with that usual mix of curiosity and discomfort, the kind that always followed them. They told him they wished to deposit their earnings, a simple enough request for any man. But the banker, he cleared his throat and looked down at his ledger, then back up at them, like they were a puzzle he couldn't solve. He went to the back, leaving them standing there, the silence in the room heavy as a wet blanket. When he came back, his face was set, and he held a crisp piece of paper, all official looking, with a wax seal pressed hard onto it. It looked like a snake biting its own tail, that seal, and I can still picture it. Lord, it had a way of making your stomach clench. He didn't even look him in the eye when he spoke. "I'm afraid I cannot accept this," he said, his voice dry as dust. He held up the paper. "We have received instruction from Mr. Silas's lawyer. It states quite clearly that you two, as the Gemini twins, are considered property of the circus. Legally, you possess no individual standing. Therefore, these funds, derived from your performances, are considered circus assets. They cannot be deposited in your name, as you have no name in the eyes of the law." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face, and Arthur, he just stiffened beside him, like a tree struck by lightning. The banker didn't hand back their coins. He just reached out a pale hand and took the small bag from Thomas's grasp, as if collecting a stray item. He placed it under the counter, and then, without another word, turned his back to them, picking up his quill pen. The metallic tang of the inkwell seemed to fill the air, like a bitter taste. "It's a terrible thing to be told you ain't even a person, to have your own sweat and labor, the very coin you earned, snatched away by a piece of paper and a man who just followed the rules? They stood there for a long moment, watching the banker scratch away at his ledger, writing down other people's lives, other people's worth. They had no place in those tidy lines, no entry in that book, no place at all. If you can't own a thing, can you truly own yourself? Lord, it's a strange thing how a man might be born into this world, breathe the same air as any other, but still be less than a shadow in the eyes of the law. I reckon that's what Thomas and Arthur were coming to understand. Deep in their bones, after that cruel business at the bank, they saw that the problem wasn't just Mr. Silas, nor the folks who stared, but the very ink and paper that said they weren't quite men at all. So, it was of an evening after the last show had ended and the circus wagons had rumbled into a new town that they started their quiet work. They'd wait until the lamp oil was burning low in the windows of the county clerk's office, until the last clerk had locked up for the night and gone home to his supper. Then, with a stealth that came from years of moving as one, always aware of every creak and shadow, they'd slip inside. The air in those places, it was heavy, I tell you. Heavy with the dry, dusty smell of old paper and the quiet secrets of a town. They risked the constable's heavy tread. They risked a sound that might give them away. But the thought of living forever as cargo, well, that risk was far heavier. They'd light a small, dark lantern, just enough to spill a circle of dim light on the stacked shelves. And there, by that poor, flickering glow, they'd begin. They'd pull down ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages thin and brittle like old leaves. They'd unroll documents tied with faded ribbon, papers that hadn't seen the light of day in years, maybe decades. The soft scratch of a quill pen on parchment, long since silent, seemed to hang in the air, a whisper of old laws and forgotten lives. They weren't looking for gold, nor for a grand escape plan written down plain. No, they were looking for cracks, for places where the rules didn't quite fit, for old laws that might have been left behind. They were studying how a man became a man on paper and how sometimes a man might just disappear from those same papers, quiet as a ghost. It was slow work, hard on the eyes and harder on the spirit, to see how many ways the world had to write a body out of its own freedom. I reckon there's a kind of freedom in knowing the cage you're in, even if the bars are made of words. For a long time, those boys just felt the weight of it, the way a tightrope walker feels the tension in the wire. But now, in those quiet, dusty rooms, they were starting to understand the slack too, the forgotten corners where the tension eased, where a man might slip through. It was a terrible shame, I tell you, that they had to learn such things just to claim their own breath. What hidden corners of the law can swallow a man whole and set him free? I reckon those boys, Thomas and Arthur, they weren't just learning to read the ledgers, no. They were learning to read the world, to see the cracks in its foundations. They'd pore over those dusty papers from the county offices like they were looking for a secret map, which, in a way, they were. And then, of an evening, when the circus lights were dimming and the crowds were gone, they'd try their hand at what they'd learned. It was in a small town, a place with muddy streets and more taverns than churches, that they made their first real move. The air in the back alleys was thick with the faint scent of cheap tobacco smoke and something sour spilled from a barrel somewhere. They moved slow, like always, their four legs working as one, but their eyes, they were darting. taking everything in. They'd seen a man selling small pouches of tobacco from a little stall set up in a dark corner, a man who didn't ask too many questions. Arthur spoke first, his voice low, a little rough from the dust of the road. "Evening, friend. Got a bit of a craving for some good leaf, if you got it." Thomas stood steady beside him, his gaze fixed on the man, ready for any shift in his eyes. They offered a few coins, worn smooth by many hands. The man behind the counter, he squinted at them in the dim light, his face shadowed beneath a wide brim. He looked at their shared body, a flicker of that usual curiosity. But it faded quick enough when he saw the coins. They had practiced this. They had come up with a name, a simple one, that could melt away like morning fog. No papers, no grand stories, just a quiet request for a simple thing. They didn't linger, didn't try to make conversation. They just wanted the tobacco and to be gone, to see if the world would let them buy something, anything, without asking for their place in Mr. Silas's books. The man nodded, took their coins, and handed over a small, unmarked satchel, the worn leather soft in their hands. He didn't ask their name. He didn't care. My hands, they tremble a little now, thinking back. It was a dangerous game they played, like walking a tightrope without a net. This poster, it shows them so brave, but the real bravery was in the quiet, hidden things they did. They turned, melting back into the shadows of the alley as quick as they had appeared, the scent of tobacco strong in their hands. They felt a strange mix of triumph and fear, like they'd just stolen something, even though they'd paid fair. It was just a pouch of tobacco, but it was their first step, a whisper of freedom. It was a taste of what it felt like to be just men buying tobacco, not the Gemini twins, not circus property. They had stretched a shadow, and for a moment it hadn't been caught by the light. How far can a shadow stretch before it gets caught by the light? The circus owner's wagon, it was a dark place, even in the daytime. Not dark like a cellar, but dark with heavy velvet and thick curtains, like it was trying to keep the outside world out, or maybe keep what was inside from ever getting out. It was early in the 1850s, I reckon, and Thomas and Arthur had been called in, not for a performance, but for a reckoning. Mr. Silas, he sat behind a big polished desk, the kind that looked like it swallowed all the light in the room. He had a cigar clamped in his teeth, and the smoke curled up slow and thick around a fancy glass bottle of spirits. He didn't offer them a seat, of course. They just stood there, two men bound together, feeling the weight of his gaze. He'd heard whispers, you see, about their quiet comings and goings, their questions in dusty offices. He didn't like it one bit. "Boys," Mr. Silas drawled, his voice like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed, "seems you've been forgetting your place." He reached for a fresh piece of paper, thick and stiff, already covered in neat looping script. The scratchy sound of his pen filling in a date felt louder than any roar from the lion's cage. He slid it across the desk. A new contract. Not a contract for performing, mind you, but for nothing. This paper, it called them retired property. It said they had no right to leave, no right to earn, no right to even speak for themselves outside of his say-so. It was meant to be the end of their plans, a lock on the last door they thought they might open. He watched them, a cruel smile playing on his lips, as if he expected them to break right there. It was a cold, hard piece of wood, that desk, and the contract felt colder still, like iron. Lord, it's a terrible thing. to have your very soul written out of existence by a man's pen. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the whole world was against them, and this new paper was the final brick in their cage. They stared at the document, the words blurring, but the meaning clear as a bell. No citizenship, no freedom, no future beyond the circus, just property. It was meant to crush them, to show them that all their quiet searching, all their hopes of slipping away were for naught. But I reckon sometimes when a cage tightens, it don't just break you. Sometimes it shows you the way out, clearer than anything else could. When the cage tightens, does it break you or show you the way out? Mr. Silas, he had a way of squeezing a man dry, then asking for more. He believed that ink on paper was stronger than any chain, and for most folks, I reckon he was right. But Thomas and Arthur, they weren't most folks. They were two souls in one skin, and sometimes that made the rules twist in ways nobody else could see. That night, after Silas had forced his new contract on them, they sat in their small tent. The canvas walls were thin, letting in the chill of the late night, and the air still held the lingering smell of damp sawdust and cheap lamp oil from the main tent. They had but one small lantern, its light casting long dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel even smaller. The paper Silas had given them, it was stiff and rustled like dry leaves as Thomas, with his steady hand, carefully spread it out. It was a cruel thing, that paper, full of small, mean words about retired property and absolute ownership. It made their stomachs clench, knowing how easily a man could be wiped away by a few lines of ink. Arthur, his brow furrowed, leaned in close, his breath fogging the air above the document. They traced the words with their shared eyes, back and forth, sentence by sentence. This wasn't just a contract. It was a cage built of language, designed to hold them forever. The silence in the tent was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of the old yellowed legal papers as they turned them, searching for a crack, a seam, anything. Thomas, he pricked a finger on a sharp corner of the brittle parchment, and a tiny bead of red welled up, a sharp, quick sting that reminded them of the stakes. Every word was a lock, every paragraph a bar. They knew Silas thought he had them. He thought he'd tightened the rope so much there was no way out, that he'd written them out of being men and into being just another part of his inventory. And the Lord's truth is, it looked that way. Their very freedom, their chance to ever walk outside the circus poster's shadow, it all hinged on finding a flaw in that document. If they didn't, they would be property, legally recognized until their dying day, or until Silas decided to simply dispose of them. But sometimes, when a man thinks he's so clever, he ties his own knots too tight. Silas, in his greed to own them completely, had used words that were meant for things, for cargo, for property that had never been human in the first place. He'd made them so utterly not men on paper that in a strange, terrible way, he'd almost erased them entirely. They saw it then. Not a way to be in the world, but a way to be out of it, to slip through the cracks of the very definitions he'd put upon them. The harder he tried to make them his, the more he defined them into a place where the law might just forget them altogether. When the cage tightens, does it break you or show you the way out? The county office was a quiet place, even in the middle of the day. It smelled of dust and old paper, like a graveyard for forgotten words. The light came in through a tall, grimy window, making the motes dance in the air. thick as summer gnats. Thomas and Arthur moved slow and careful, a single shadow stretching, long and thin, across the worn floorboards. They weren't in their bright silks now. They were just two men, quiet and watchful, like folks studying a map. They had found it, tucked away in a ledger, half-eaten by time and forgotten by all but the mice. An old form, yellowed and crisp, about disposed property. It was the kind of paper folks used to fill out when a broken plow was sold for scrap, or an old barn pulled down. It was a paper for things that had ceased to be useful or had simply vanished from the world's eye. And that, I reckon, was the whole point. Arthur's good hand held the quill, steady as a stone. Thomas leaned close, his eyes tracing the lines, making sure every word was just so. They were using Mr. Silas's own greedy contract against him, twisting his words like a knot in a rope. That contract, the one meant to bind them forever as retired property, it had a way of being seen as something to be disposed of too. That was the trick, you see. If they were just property, then they could be property that was gone. Lord, it's a strange thing how a man can spend his life making noise and grand shows, but the real work, the work that frees you, is done in quiet, with just a scratch of a pen. It was a dangerous thing, them sitting there, filling out that form. If anyone walked in, if anyone asked too many questions, it would all come undone. Their freedom, just a wisp of smoke then, gone in the wind. Their status as property would be hammered down, solid and true, with no way out. But they didn't flinch. They just kept on, writing themselves out of a life they never truly got to live. How do you leave a place without ever having been officially there? The circus grounds, they were a sight to behold when the show was on, all lights and noise. But when it came time to pack up, Lord, it was a different kind of chaos. Wagons creaked and groaned, like old bones complaining about the journey ahead. Men shouted, canvas flapped, and the air was thick with the dust kicked up from 100 boot steps. You could still catch the faint, sweet smell of burnt sugar from the concession stands, mingling with the damp earth and the tired animals. It was a messy, hurried business, and no one paid much mind to the empty spaces, not at first. But Mr. Silas, he noticed. He walked through the camp like a man who'd lost his shadow, his eyes darting this way and that. He went straight for the spot where Thomas and Arthur's little tent had always been, a small patch of ground now just like any other, save for the faint imprint of where the poles had stood. He kicked at the dirt, then spun around, his face getting redder by the minute. He called out, his voice sharp, asking anyone who'd listened if they'd seen the Gemini twins. No one had. They just shook their heads and went about their packing. The wind, it whistles through the cracks in this old house sometimes, and it sounds like a ghost. That's what they became. You, see, ghosts in the great machine of the world. This poster, it's just paper now, a memory of something that ain't real anymore. I touch the yellowed edge and I can almost feel the chill of that empty space where those boys used to be. A silence where there had always been a show. Mr. Silas, he tore through their old belongings, what little there was left. He yanked open empty trunks, tossed aside old costumes, but found nothing. Not a single note, not a hint of where they'd gone. He questioned the roustabouts, the ticket takers, even the cook, but everyone just shrugged. It was the Lord's truth that they were gone, vanished like a puff of smoke. But the real truth, the deeper one, was that they hadn't just left. They had, in a way, never truly been there at all. That new contract Mr. Silas had forced them to sign, the one meant to bind them tighter than ever, well, it had a way of cutting them loose instead, by making them retired property. In such a specific, greedy way, he'd given them the very words they needed to unright themselves. They weren't vagrants because they weren't citizens to begin with. They weren't property because, in a twist of the law, they had filed themselves away as disposed property, no longer belonging to anyone, not even the ledgers. The law couldn't find what it never truly saw. Mr. Silas, he could shout and stamp all he wanted. He could wave his contracts in the air, but his ownership claims, they were just words on paper. And those boys, they had made sure those words didn't mean a thing anymore. They had pulled themselves out of the great grinding machine of the circus, not by running, but by making themselves invisible to its greedy gears. They were free, you see, because the law couldn't cage what it couldn't even name. What happens when the hunter can no longer find his prey? Because the prey was never truly recorded. This old poster, it shows them in their fine costumes, smiling for the crowd. But the real story, the one I've told you, it ain't on this paper. It's written in the quiet spaces between the lines where two souls found a way to be truly their own. I fold the brittle paper gently, smoothing it with my thumb, feeling the faint, old ink under my skin. It's just a picture now, a shadow of a time that's gone. But the freedom they found, that I reckon is a thing that lasts forever.